Hi, my name's Sarah Kilmer, and I'm a psychologist at Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab, and today I'm going to be talking about stress management and coping. Now, the first thing I want to do is give you a definition for stress. And the definition that I like to use is that you can think of it as your body and your brain's response to a demand. Put another way, you can think of it as any change that requires you to make a change. Now, this is a broad definition, but I think that's useful because it encourages us to think very broadly when we're considering where our stress might be coming from. Now, stress can come from all different parts of life, and it's very personal. What's stressful for one person may not be such a big deal for someone else. I think naturally we tend to think of stress as coming from major negative life events, and that's certainly true. So these are things like illness or injury, loss of a job, or death of a loved one. What's important to not overlook, though, is that stress can come from other kinds of events. So small, everyday hassles that we all have to deal with do put demands on our time and our energy, and so that can become part of our stress. Even positive life events, things that you were planning or looking forward to, take us out of our comfort zone and change our routine, and so those can be stressful. Stress can come from factors outside of us, so things about world events, for example, now dealing with COVID-19, other people, pressures or demands from others. Those are outside sources. Stress can also come from inside of us, and those sources are things like our thoughts or our expectations or the meaning that we give to situations. So all of this is just to say, when you're thinking about where stress comes from, cast a broad net. Now, there's lots of reasons why we pay attention to stress here. There's sort of the obvious ones in that it can affect our quality of life and it can affect our emotions. It also can have a really direct effect on what's happening with your body. So one thing that happens when we feel stressed or threatened in some way is our body reacts with this thing that's called the fight or flight response, which some of you may have heard of. And basically, it's your body mobilizing to deal with a danger. And there's some pretty predictable things that happen. So, it affects your heart rate and your blood pressure and your breathing rate. You're kind of mobilizing to deal with a threat by either fighting it off or running away. So it's fight or flight. There's also a freeze response, but we're not going to get into that right now. Now, is stress always bad for you, you might wonder? And the short answer is no, because on one level, it is a survival mechanism. And, most of us aren't facing life-threatening situations right now, but you can think back to the way life used to be a long time ago, where maybe you'd be out on your land and a bear comes jumping out from behind the bush, and, you're going to have to do something about that pretty quickly if you were going to survive. So it's useful in a survival mechanism like that. In modern life, it can be helpful because it can serve as a source of motivation. So a certain amount of stress might motivate you to work harder at your job, or frankly, if people didn't feel a certain amount of stress about their health, you wouldn't be trying to do something about it. So there are some ways in which it's helpful. One thing that's tricky, though, about modern life is that the stress response doesn't always fit the situation. So like if we think back to the situation of survival with the bear, it's pretty time limited, going to be over one way or the other pretty quickly. Modern stressors often don't have a definite endpoint. So there are these chronic, ongoing kinds of situations where we're worrying about our health or the world situation, or when life is going to start to feel normal again, or we've got concerns about the health and well-being of family members or our finances. I mean, any number of things that don't have a definite endpoint can become stressful, can trigger these kinds of stress responses, and it's this chronic ongoing stress that tends to be harmful to our health. It can get in the way of your body doing its normal healthy functioning. It can affect your immune system. It can make it harder to manage existing health problems. So let's say you've got diabetes and you're stressed, it might be harder to manage your blood sugars. And then there's some more indirect but still powerful ways that stress can affect our health. And so these are things like, when we're stressed out, we tend to be more tired, and that can make it harder to have the energy and motivation to do things that we know are good for us, like exercise and eat in a healthy manner. Another thing is that sometimes we choose to cope in ways that make us feel good in the short run, but hurt us in the long run. So maybe we try to cope by eating comfort foods or just sitting on the couch and watching television, or maybe we pick up the cigarettes again or drink too much alcohol. So they're all different kinds of ways in which stress can take a toll on you. Now, sometimes people aren't sure if stress is taking a toll on them, and so I've listed here some of the common signs. Now, everyone's different, so you may not have all of them, and certainly these are not unique to stress. There are any number of reasons why you might have a change in your sleep patterns, your eating habits. You might have a change in your energy level, mood, or concentration, and it may not be because of stress, but certainly if you notice these kinds of changes in yourself, it's worthwhile to think about whether or not stress is playing a role. So then what do you do about it? Well, I think the good news in all of this is that there are a lot of things that really can be very helpful, and it doesn't have to be complicated. I think a good starting point is thinking about what you've done in the past to cope with stress, and if you have strategies or resources or skills that help you and don't end up hurting you in the long run, by all means, continue with those and then look to see if there's anything that you can add to it. You can try to figure out where your stress is coming from and try to problem solve or plan ahead. Try to give yourself enjoyable experiences each day, because stress can come sometimes not so much from lots of bad things happening, but not enough good things to look forward to. Take breaks when you need to. Try to be patient with yourself and those around you. Trying to be active, exercise, get outside, try to find the humor in things. These are all hopefully things that could become part of your daily life on some scale and could really help balance out stress. And then some other ideas listed here. I won't read through all of them, but things that help us settle physically can be helpful. So deep breathing, relaxation, meditation, counting to 10, finding other outlets to express your concerns can also be helpful. Now, I'm going to take the remaining time and talk about a few particular strategies in a little bit more detail. And, when we're thinking about coping with stress, healthy and effective coping can often be seen as falling into two broad categories. And so there's practical problem solving and then management of our emotions. So starting with practical problem solving, it can really be helpful to use your planning and organizational skills. It can be useful to start off by just taking an inventory of everything you're trying to do right now. So responsibilities as well as positive activities, right? We got to know what we're up against before we know what to do. So you can put this in any kind of format that makes sense to you. It might be a to-do list all together. You might put your activities out onto the calendar to get the visual for what it's going to look like over the span of a week or a month, and go through, put it in writing, and then go back through and see if you can figure out where stress is coming from. It might be that there are certain particular activities that are stressful. It might be no one thing in particular, but more the flow of activities during the week. So maybe you end up with days that are too busy and that feels super stressful. It also might be the case that you have days where you don't have enough going on, and that can be stressful just in a different way. And then once you've got a sense of what might be contributing to your stress, you can use skills that you've probably made use of in other parts of your life. So identify priorities, try to plan ahead, budget your time, delegate responsibility as you can. All those kinds of skills and strategies can be really helpful, because as a general rule, things that give us a greater sense of control and predictability in life, those things help lower stress. And then there's also just the fact that putting things in writing is an organizing process, and sometimes getting it out of our head and onto paper is clarifying, and it can help with some of that uneasy feeling that we've got when we know we've got a lot to do and we're concerned that we're going to forget some of it. If it's on paper, you've got a backup. Another thing people can do with putting things in writing is they can use this as a way to kind of dump things off of their mind in the evening so that you have an easier time going to sleep. So this is a useful strategy if you go to bed at night and it's like your brain turns on and you can't stop thinking about everything going on in your life. Now, this next strategy about paying attention to and accepting your feelings is kind of a combination of managing emotions and then also some practical problem solving. So it's important to pay attention to your feelings. Sometimes people can get into the habit of pushing their feelings away, and on the one hand, this is understandable because who wants to go around feeling angry or upset or stressed out? The difficulty is that if we do this too quickly, we may be missing out on important information because our feelings are signals about things that are going on in our life. If you need something to compare it to, you could think about how at first glance it might seem nice to not feel physical pain, but if you didn't feel physical pain and you accidentally put your hand down on a hot stove burner, you'd be missing out on some pretty important information about something that needs your attention right away. So if you can use that same kind of model about your feelings, then it's a signal. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not something to be scared of. It's information. And you can pay attention to it in any way that feels comfortable to you. You might decide to just take some quiet time during the day and tune in and see what's going on. You might want to put it down in a diary or a journal and then look back through it. Try to make a note of any kind of pattern. So for example, if a person notices that they are feeling kind of down and stressed at the end of the day, they might realize that it's because it's too quiet in their house and they're feeling lonely or bored. And wow, then they realize that they're coping with it by going into the kitchen and eating food that they don't really need. So if you can kind of go back to the start of that, someone's feeling lonely and that's stressful to them, that's a legitimate concern that needs attention. Maybe there's a way to meet that need in a healthier way. So maybe that person's going to plan to call family or friends in the evening or have a good book or a good movie on hand so that they don't find themselves eating in the kitchen and then still feeling upset. Certainly it's useful to find an outlet. If you've got someone you trust, you could talk with them. Some people, again, like to make use of a journal. For some folks, they can use their spiritual faith. But the idea is that you don't dwell on feelings in a way that's unproductive, but you pay attention to acknowledge and release them and then see if there's anything you can do to help with coping. And then it's also important to pay attention to the way we think about things because some stress comes from where we set our expectations. Now, it's important to have goals and standards, and those do help us try to be our best. The difficulty is that sometimes our goals or our standards or expectations are not a good match for our current circumstances. And so, if I'm expecting myself to perform at the highest level that I was doing, 20 years ago before I had any health problems, and now 20 years has gone by and my health status has changed, that's not a reasonable expectation. And the difference between where I'm at right now and where I think I should be may produce stress if I feel like I'm falling short. So it's not that people do this to themselves on purpose, it just kind of happens, but it can be helpful to just take a little bit of time and think, honestly about what your expectations are and evaluate if they're a good match for where you're at in your life right now. It might be useful to even just temporarily modify expectations or put them on hold and then reevaluate at a later date. If you still have like a big goal that you're working towards, it can really be helpful to break it up into smaller units so that you get a sense of momentum and accomplishment. Now, another way in which our thinking can affect us is by something that's called self-talk. We're not really talking to ourselves, but what it is that, most of us have this internal dialogue in thought form with ourselves, where we think about ourselves during the day, and we think about what went well, what didn't go well, and there's often a mix of tone in there. But sometimes what can happen is people can become overly self-critical, and you may be familiar with the expression where people say they're their own worst critic. So that's what this is getting at, where people feel they're just overly judgmental about themselves, and then that pressure becomes part of their stress. And sometimes people can even think that this kind of self-criticism is useful. It's like the mental kick in the pants to work harder, but usually it doesn't get us very far, and we just end up feeling worse. So this is another exercise in self-awareness. Just tune into your self-talk. Just be an observer at first. Try to listen for the tone. Are you giving yourself encouraging messages, or are you putting yourself down? You can be on the lookout for extreme kinds of words, because those often make stress higher. So these are things like always, never. They're just kind of dramatic language, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And then when you find those kinds of things going on, try to see if you can soften it or modify it. And some examples would be on your screen, but I'll try to put it in context. Like if I'm trying to do a task and I'm struggling with it, and I start thinking, it's horrible, it's always going to be this bad, I can't stand it, that distress, those kinds of thoughts may be an honest reflection of how upset I am. But the difficulty is that if I leave it there, I'm going to be much more stressed and hopeless than if I can take a step back from it and try to reevaluate. Well, maybe it's really horrible, but I've been through hard things before, and I know I can get through this thing now. Or, maybe I can just remind myself that I'm going to do the best that I can. Perhaps it's even a little easier than it was 3 weeks ago. So I'm not pretending things are okay when they're not. But I am trying to dial back the intensity of my thoughts to something that maybe is more reasonable and certainly more encouraging. Now, another thing to do, in addition to kind of softening your language, looking out for intense words, is remind yourself that thoughts are not the same things as facts, even though we often treat them that way. So, I could sit here and think that I'm a rainbow-colored unicorn, and that would be kind of amusing. But we all know that's not true. And I know that that's a ridiculous example, and I actually do that on purpose because nobody's going to believe that. And yet there are all kinds of thoughts that we just treat as facts. So these might be things like, I'm not the kind of person who's going to exercise regularly, or I'm not the kind of person who's going to eat fish 3 times a week, or if I'm not working full time and taking care of my family, then I'm not worth very much, or I'm a burden. And those thoughts do have an element of your experience, and that's true and should be honored. And at the same time, y'all are a lot more complex than that. And so just be careful not to back yourself into a corner with your thinking. And then the last one, which maybe is hopefully particularly relevant right now with COVID-19, is just to try to remind yourself that a lot of life's troubles, or at least some of them, are time limited, and reminding ourselves of that can lessen our stress and distress. And so when you find yourself thinking about upsetting situations and wondering when life is going to get back to normal, or you're going to see your family easily again, or any number of things, just tack on the 2 words "for now." And what that does is it helps us remember that things are always changing, and there's a good chance that things could improve. And then the last thing I just wanted to point out is that a lot of what you're doing for your physical health does double duty and can actually also help with managing stress. So if you keep a consistent routine, get enough sleep, try to have your bedtime and waking time be consistent from day to day, eat healthier foods, exercise regularly, practice some of the things you get exposed to at the program with deep breathing and relaxation. All of that is going to be good for your physical health and well-being, and in turn can help you tolerate stress. And then here's a list of some sources for this information, as well as resources for further reading. The American Heart Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Lung Association, as well as the COPD Foundation, has all kinds of useful information about stress and stress management, as well as how you can manage stress and anxiety in the context of the particular health concern that you've got. National Institute of Mental Health has a lot of good information. And then the Greater Good Science Center has sort of short summary articles on a lot of different wellness enhancing practices, as well as information and directions about how to do some of these things if you're interested in that. Now, if you've got any questions about anything, please follow up with your coordinator about it. I appreciate everyone's attention here, and